Okay. Good morning, Marcia. If you would introduce yourself, please.
Okay, I am Marcia McQuern. I was born Marcia Knopf and in Riverside and was raised here. I went away to college in Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara, and I majored in political science because I was fascinated with politics. Growing up, I thought I was going to be a phys ed teacher. I was very athletic, but I didn't have great stamina and kept getting blisters, so I was steered a bit away from that. I loved the college newspaper. It was a hobby. I didn't think of it as a career. But then I realized I had to do something after college, and I thought I would. I didn't. There was no journalism at Santa Barbara, so I hired a guy who was a journalism teacher up north in Chico as our advisor, and he stayed there. That is, tried to teach us about things. I thought there was all these secrets I didn't know, but once I got to graduate school, I realized within a couple of weeks it was mainly lingo. I didn't know the terms for things. I'd go to these conferences, and these journalism majors would be very aggressive and scary to me. But I found out if I was nice to the secretaries, the men tried to date them, and I just treated them as equals. And I got more out of them than the guys did. And there were hardly any women in journalism at the time, except on women's pages. My first summer job was writing wedding stories, and I had never read one all the way through. All I cared about was who got married. And I survived that, and I had people's hobbies, people collecting doll houses, and I was pretty bored with that pretty quick. But my second summer, I got to do filling in. There were racial things going on in the 60s, and later people looking at my clips were amazed. They were trusting some kid to cover these things. Well, it wasn't as scary in Riverside as it was in other places, but I didn't tell them that. I had really good bosses that kept encouraging me, and so I sort of fell in love with it and realized that you can make a living at this. Not a big one, but you could do that the rest of the time, and it was always different. It was never boring at all, and I had to psych myself to thinking this dollhouse collector was an interesting woman, and trying to get some things out of her that would be interesting to other people. So I just kind of accidentally got into it and loved it. I never was bored. I did a series on divorcing and how the courts treated women compared to men, and I had just some interesting summer jobs, and I said, okay, I'm going to see if I can get a job. And I came back home to do that, and I had really great bosses who kept pushing me beyond where I thought I could go, but supported me, so I learned.
And that was in Santa Barbara where you returned back to?
Riverside.
Riverside.
Yeah, it was my hometown.
Okay.
My parents were teachers. I thought I was going to be a teacher.
Okay.
And after I couldn't do phys ed, I thought I could teach political science, history, social sciences, because I thought it was important stuff people learn about how things work. Amazing how people don't know how the government works, and that was just useful, and it gave me a framework for asking rude questions. I was shy, but I wasn't afraid to ask on behalf of other people, so I was brave in those in those situations, and I didn't try to look real aggressive and scary like some people did. I just tried to draw them out, and I figured a way to get interested in whoever it was, even a dollhouse lady, and that was what you had to do, is get interested in them. And most people will open up once you start. You're listening and not just babbling, and they appreciate that. So, and I always was my first big story. I can't remember what it was. It was something And it was a judge who was the father of a friend of mine. And he asked if he offered to review my story. Well, I didn't know it was a very big no-no, because people will change, but they don't like the way they look, and so they'll deny saying something. This is why they don't let you show them. And I was in big trouble, and they knew I didn't know any better. But I learned that because people shift, and you can't deal with that. So I showed the guy, the judge, the story, as I promised, because I'd given the word of the paper, and they honored it, the paper did. And he had one comma that was correct. I should have had the comma there, and it was some other word that he came up with a better word, and that's all he did. He didn't try to do anything weird, so I was lucky.
Your career outside of college began here in Riverside with the Press Enterprise?
Right. Well, I was on the school paper
Okay.
as a high school. I was the number 2, the news editor.
Okay.
You were elected in those days.
So you grew up here in Riverside, and you went to UC Santa Barbara?
Right.
And you were on the newspaper there?
Right.
Okay. Returning home here, this change of plan from going as a phys ed instructor, you were thinking, well, I could teach, but then I've got this experience that I've had on the newspaper, and maybe I can pick up something here at the local paper, Press Enterprise.
Well, I interviewed in graduate school. People were lining up to hire you out of Northwestern. We froze to death in the snow, but so it was a different world. But I was trying to decide whether to marry this guy. So I figured I'd better check it out, or I might regret it. So I came back. He was out of LA. And I decided not to marry him, and I'm glad I didn't. So then I started looking for what's the next step. I was talking to some people at the LA Times, and back east, the Northwestern mainly people recruited for Midwestern papers and East Coast papers, not very much West. And Gannett was a very bad reputation chain at the time. It's much improved over the years. But they actually said, well, we don't usually hire women because we start people on the police beat at night, and we're afraid that the women will be attacked or something. And that open about it. And they said, we usually start, excuse me.
Don't worry, just take a moment.
And it was a good experience to do police work. I never got it. I don't know if it was because of the night thing, but I had so much interest in politics, and I covered government, and I thought that was a good way to explain to people how things worked. And I covered City Hall, I covered county supervisors, I did special projects, investigative things. And there was a fake university here called Riverside University. They bought a small legitimate business school and turned it into this law school, journalism school, all these other things. And my bosses were saying, this is weird. And the leadership of the town was on their board. And the guy that was setting it up, it's weird. It didn't sound right. So we got to investigating. Turned out the law school dean had been disbarred from Florida. And the journalism dean was a kind of a hack on small town papers, and not very good ones. And these people were using up their GI benefits to go to this school. And so we just dug really deep and found out all these strange things. And we realized we had to hurry up because people were wasting their benefits. And so we did, and the first story, we thought we had to hurry up with the law school thing because that was so dramatic. And came out and the town turned on us. They were angry. We were ruining this local thing. So we just kept digging. We planned a series on the thing, and we finally, as we came out day after day, slowly people called to apologize in town because we had a cold. There's one error we made, and it was the price of a book. We took the word of somebody who didn't really know, and it wasn't. That was the word. That was the only error we made. So we had to do a correction, which is maddening. But the town finally realized that they were taken, and there were people donating money to this thing, and in good faith. They thought it was legit, and they eventually closed, and people no longer thought we were ruining this local star thing. But that was the deepest we ever got. We got it. It was in the final round of the Pulitzer, but we didn't make it. And the people that won should have won. It was the My Lai attack in Vietnam, where the Americans killed all these people they shouldn't have. And so, I didn't feel bad about losing, but the fact that we got in the final round was kind of neat. It goes to the full board. The Pulitzer board, awards drama and all sorts of other things besides the journalism. And it's kind of the ultimate thing. But and people, when they look at our stories later, said, "Why didn't you win?" I said, "Because this other thing was a bigger deal." And so a lot of that is the story you're on. How big a deal, what happened afterward. But it's very legitimate. I've been on a juror like 3-4 times. It's sort of an honor to be even in that position. But it's a heck of 3-4 days. You're reading 9 million things and trying to figure out who's the best in a category. You're divided up into groups of about 4 or 5. You read them and go crazy.
What were the specific years that was occurring? I presume it's the late 60s.
Let's see, when was it? Yeah, it was late 60s.
Was
70s.
Was the story that got the Pulitzer dealing with My Lai?
Yeah.
Okay.
They exposed it.
Okay.
And it was very legitimate.
Of course.
And they clearly should have won that. Because, again, the people were accusing journalists of being unpatriotic because we weren't always towing the line. And you just can't forgive lies in journalism. And so somebody, you're asked who's the source, you have to tell at least one editor and why you trust them. And because you take anonymous sources sometimes, but you got to be sure they know what they're talking about. As we didn't on the price of a book. It was kind of fun. It's a thrill. You get a thrill of, I figured this out when people were trying to hide things. That when you can figure it out, what's really going on and how you're going to show it so other people will believe it. I may have given a wrong impression because after here I went to Sacramento and I went to San Diego. In fact, I got recruited out of San Diego to Sacramento, and I was the capital correspondent for a while.
So you came back to Riverside, were here, then you went to San Diego?
First I went to Sacramento, and then I went to San Diego.
Okay. So I just want to get the order. So you were first here in Riverside, then you went up to Sacramento, and then you were recruited from Sacramento down to San Diego, and then eventually you came back to Riverside.
Yeah, I did. It was so strange to, go back to the same place, but I grew up here, so I knew all sorts of understanding of what Riverside was about and the county was about. And it was spring. People couldn't understand why I would come back, but the owner was great, and my line editor was great. So I felt like I could do legitimate work, and they kept promoting me every couple of years. After I covered county supervisors for a year, the second round, okay, now how things work. and I could do better the next time. And then they kept giving me another beat I didn't know, and so I had to learn again.
Was it the Sacramento Bee that you worked for? Okay.
Right, yeah. That was a very interesting, I was an editor up there. I was recruited to be an editor, and because I was city editor here, and my previous the city editor I was hired to be with, he went up there and he came after me. And so I really never had to work too hard at getting the next job. Opportunities came up and I decided to take them.
And the San Diego paper for which you worked?
Was the Union. They were separate. Now it's the Union Tribune is combined, as most papers, morning and evening papers are combined. But in fact, there was a big plane crash that we did a lot of work on. And the rival paper, which we were taught to hate, the same owner, but they won the Pulitzer because they had an accurate story out within about less than an hour. And that was amazing. I mean, how to do that. Now, we did all this deep stuff, investigating all these problems, etc. And my people, in fact, that came out, and I told the editor who was in charge at that moment to, let's get a story about a local paper does good. And he kicked a wastebasket across the giant room and stormed out. Because, we had done really good work, but within an hour is pretty darn good. And so I looked around, and who's the newest person here that hasn't learned to hate yet? I found somebody. They did the story, and I walked over. We were never supposed to cross the hallway. And I went over there with this reporter in tow and went to the editor, and I said, may we cross the hallway, and will you talk about, we want to do a story on a local paper getting this big deal. And he smiled and chuckled, and he said, sure. And he held my reporter. So that was weird.
Yeah. So this series of events that you've recounted right here, they're really extending then from about the mid to late 60s into the 70s. Mm-hmm. And your work with Riverside and then later Sacramento and San Diego is based upon your early work with government issues, legislative issues, city hall issues.
Yes, yeah, I was seldom the person they call for a big murder or something like that, because I was into the issues and trying to explain them to people that held only marginal interest and get them interested enough in why it was important to them. I tended to go there, and I just love figuring things out, especially when they're trying to be hidden. And a lot of times the government understandably wants to look good, especially politicians and the government. But if you dealt with administrative people, they just wanted accuracy mainly. They weren't usually trying to hide things. But if you just establish your reputation as trying to be fair and getting it right, it became easier. But it was fun to try to figure out how to get at something where you could print it. Everybody wanted to be off the record, and the paper, a good paper, tries not to have anonymous sources, and you have to have at least two usually if they're going to be anonymous, and you have to really make sure they're accurate. Were they in a position to know what they're talking about? Did they ever lie to us? That was one of the first questions an editor would ask. And if they have, dump him. But he may not be lying this time, you just never know. And if people have before been open and been accurate about something, especially if it was not in their best interest necessarily, okay, you trusted it. And that was the trick, to find people you could trust. And there was a legislator up in Sacramento who was dicey, and kept trying to figure out, how can I get this out so people know and don't re-elect him? But they always were re-electing the incumbents in those days. never did do it.
Let's talk a little bit then about your experience then in Sacramento. Who were some of the colorful characters, if I can use that
Willie
expression?
Brown was speaker, and he was the smartest guy up there. He was smarter than any reporter, any other politician. And he would give you, answer the question, and then he'd stop. So you've got enough. You're only going to give me 2-3 paragraphs. I've given you what I want you to print about that. And the TV guys, he would only give, you've got your 15 seconds. You're not gonna run anymore. And he would just tantalize you because he was smarter than anybody. And he was interesting. He didn't lie. You have to carefully listen because there were he skipped through the gaps sometimes, but he was fascinating. And Jerry Brown was fascinating. I was in there. I was covering him in his first terms, and I was starting to use a tape recorder, which most of us didn't at the time, and I forgot to turn it on. And he looked at it one time and looked at me, and I just said this. I'd go with, I didn't say anything. I just kept going with my questions. So I felt stupid, but he was sharp, very sharp. And he knew how to handle, but he wasn't as blatantly controlling as Willie Brown was. He was really good.
Same question for San Diego. I know it's not, where the state capital is at, and issues are not as politicized, but was there any colorful characters in San Diego?
Yeah, the owner was a very conservative Republican. Her husband, Jim Copley, had died, and he used his paper for his political ends. And luckily, the people that hired me were legitimate news people and struggling to deal with all this. But when she was tired of being looked down on because the journalism community did not respect the San Diego papers. And she wanted to go straight. And it was hard for her because we were not always doing what the establishment wanted. She was very much the establishment, very powerful. And she hired some people that would do her. They weren't real journalists, we thought. They're political people. But Jerry Warren, who worked for Nixon in the White House, was a very legitimate journalist and a good man. And so we trusted him. There was a whole group came in after Jim died. And they turned it. So it was straight. And it was fun sort of being part of that. But the people above me often had to have hard talks with the journalists, and we all knew that if we stood our ground on ethical grounds, they would go with us and they would protect us. So it was great being part of that new wave that made a difference in that community. And so
At some point then, you came back from San Diego into Riverside.
right, the executive editor died, Norman Chernus, and he was a great newspaper editor. And at the funeral reception, the owner of the paper, who was also the editor, said, "I got to talk to you, Marcia." He says, "Can we talk next week?" And I said, "Sure." And he wanted to hire me back with the idea of me running the news side after maybe a year. Come back and get reacquainted. And so there was a guy who'd been wanting to retire who was the managing editor of the morning paper. And he was great. He'd say, "Boss, what do you want me to do today?" And so I would sometimes have him take on something that had to be done that was sticky. There was some question about when he did people treat his attack for heart attack. A second one, did they treat it properly? So I had to investigate. It was really awkward. because we were looking into how he was treated, and I told the people that were suspicious, there's nothing here you can deal with. There's no evidence whatsoever they did anything wrong. And so they let me drop it, but boy, I had to dig. And the owner asked me to come and, check things out. And so I interviewed every single staff member about what they thought was good, that shouldn't change, what should change, and what their career goals were. It was a great intro, because I could start, when I started, I could not make mistakes, because I had all these people telling me what's what. So, and then they eventually, and it was a long-term, really good editor who looked like he should have been given the job, but there was an awkward, and there was, the editor just couldn't sync with him. And they weren't enemies, but it was just, I felt a little awkward, because he deserved it in many ways. And he felt that too, and he knew he was smarter than I was in some things. And but the editor and I just really, he went to the same church my parents did, and he grew up here, and we just we understood each other. And also we knew that I would tell him the truth. Like, he would ask me, the business guys are telling me this, what do you think? And news people normally don't think, but I'd watched everything. And I told him, and he said, why would they tell me that? And I said, because they don't want to disappoint you. And I would tell him what he didn't want to hear about what was going on. And so we just had absolute sync in brains. And how we ethically, he and his gang had taught me what I needed to know. And so it was absolutely never a bad problem, which was great. But I felt awkward. Mm-hmm. So I came back not thinking, I thought I was escaping Riverside. As I'm growing up in Riverside, everybody wanted to escape. And I did for a while, but it was a unique opportunity, and nobody else was going to give me that kind of opportunity. So,
what year was that?
I'd have to look it up. Let's see, what was I got out of grad school in '66, and then it was years, 5-6 years. So I know I'd have to look it up to know. It was mid '70s.
Okay. You've seen Riverside change dramatically over the many decades since then.
Yes, very dramatically. It was I remember going downtown with my parents, and people would wave across the street and they'd stop and chat, and it was a pretty small community. I think it was like 80,000 forever, it seemed like. And of course it's now, 300 something? That's a huge difference. And all these people came in from LA and Orange County. They could afford a nice house. They couldn't afford it in Orange County increasingly. So we had all these foreigners, I call them, coming in that were from LA or Orange County. And you felt, now people want to sort of apologize for Riverside, and they didn't then. They were small, and they've had that small town look, but it was, if you felt it was a good community, and doing all right. And our leaders were like this Arthur Littleworth that was a school board president for a long time. They integrated voluntarily before anybody else was, of any size anyway. And so we felt like we were doing the right thing. A lot of times we felt we were better than all those big city people. But now a lot of people apologize. They don't have the deep roots. You don't have a lot of people staying here. Tim Hayes, who ran the paper for a long time, the family leader on the paper, he grew up here and came back. He was an FBI agent during World War II, which was interesting. He said he fired his gun once and it was an accident. He laughed about it. So it was, there were these leaders knew each other, and there would be, I remember Tim would call me into his office and say, have you checked on this? And we were working on a controversial story. And I soon learned that meant he knew something I didn't that would change my idea about it. But he kept his word, even these groups that didn't go public, Monday Morning Group being one of them. And when he said, have you checked that? I think that's really true. He wouldn't reveal what he'd learned, but I knew the warnings that we were about to make a mistake unless we checked further. And he never let us make a mistake, but he wouldn't reveal what he wasn't supposed to. Maddening. Because I knew the signs, and sometimes you couldn't find out.
But those warning questions that he gave you impelled you to dig further before you went forward with the story.
Yeah, he never let us make a mistake, thank God. but it was infuriating when we couldn't. I just would hold it if I couldn't figure it out. Usually you could. You just asked enough questions and got more sources. But it was infuriating when in ethics, I had to kill the story because I knew it wasn't right. Somebody just killed it for a day, but until we figured it out.
What year did you retire from editorship of the paper?
2002, near the end of that. By then, the paper had been sold to Medill, which ran at Dallas Morning News and a whole bunch of TV stations. And it was very different. Once they were much more for profit. In fact, Tim would say, he'd figured out what the profit was that year or something, and he would say, this is embarrassing, we're making too much money. So what's on your wish list? So I had a list, prioritized list I always had in my back pocket we need another reporter here, or a new section there. He started, every year we would, the business guys would put together a budget for news because we didn't do budgets in the news department. So Tim would ask me the same question, what's your projection? So I'd give it, and I asked the business guy, how did you come up with that number? And I said, I listened to your passion about how we need to do more stuff. And then I look at the ad projections, and I've learned that you usually win those fights, so I up it. And he came to her pretty darn close. But as we went into a normal ownership, below, and then they sold to some strange people. They were much more profit-oriented, and they never were embarrassed by too much money. But he would prove certain things, so I made a list every year about what we ought to do if we had money. And Tim would look down the list and usually pick the top 3, 4. And then sometimes he'd go way down and pick one, because he liked it. So we did that, and then after a couple months of good profits, he called me in and said, things are looking good. What's next? And so we'd go down the list some more and tick off a few more. So I realized never to be upset when he didn't do everything that first round. If I made the case for those new things, we'd get pretty well what we wanted. It was a very different world than it is now. I don't know where it was in San Diego or Sacramento, but it was good, interesting to know.
You were, well, not unique, you were uncommon by being in that position, an editor for a major newspaper in California, United States at that time.
Well, there weren't very many women, hardly at all. I would be the only woman in a lot of things. In fact, I started covering business which I wasn't all that interested in, but I would sit in the side, in the back, sometimes arrive a little late, and so there wasn't a big attention to me. And people thought I was somebody's secretary at first, so I get all these great stories. People would say horrible things and report them. Then they learned. But I never really felt badly treated by my editors because I didn't go places where they were doing that. Like the one that, we started women only at night. I mean, you started newcomers only at night, and we don't do women. Just amazingly blatant. But I had, good people above me usually. And if anybody was not so good, it disappeared pretty quick. And not that I was after them or anything, but I just was lucky. It's accidents,
You mentioned at the outset this major story here in Riverside regarding a new law school that was acting inappropriately. Were there other stories that come to mind, big stories that were covered during your tenure here in Riverside?
That was the biggest. Oh, what did we do? Well, there were racial things, especially in summer. Protests and things that was new to Riverside. People were so shocked at this. And it was during the LA riots that we were working too. And the leadership in town said, not in Riverside. So they got together and did all these things like closing the totally segregated school that the blacks were sent to. And the lines were drawn so that in those early days that people were segregated into schools. And then they decided we're going to have to fix this. And they did.
If I may interrupt you, when are you referring to 1965 or 1992?
65.
65, right. The Watts riots, the AK Watts riots.
They were there, and when they had these big public meetings in Riverside, there were buses came in from LA of protesters, and they positioned themselves around the room. And Art Littleworth, the chair of the board, went to the meeting, but the police had undercover people all over the place. And he stood there and took the stuff, and he said, we realize that's a problem, we're going to do this. It's already ordered up, and quickly changed things. And it was very interesting, and the whole town was pleased with it because we didn't have the LA problem at all. And there were people in town who were upset about things, and we treated them fairly. And so it turned out there was no spark to do what happened in LA at all. And it was, when the school board people were introduced the next few weeks, after that kind of one meeting, the whole audience stood up and applauded them. And it was kind of surprising. And the audience was a chamber of commerce type thing. At this chamber, we were lucky. It was a much better chamber than most. It looked long term. And they supported these things that we're doing to fix the problems. And when the city wanted to tax them more, they would stand up and say, well, that's too much, how about this? And they would negotiate. And so they weren't always no, which was different than either in Sacramento or San Diego. Very different.
I know it's a number of years ago, but do you have any recollection of what the racial demographics were at that time? Was there a significant black population in Riverside?
It's never been huge. It was like 7-8% in Riverside. There were more Latinos, but not as many as there are now. Now the Latinos are the majority. But they aren't in the leadership quite, but they're increasingly becoming. But yeah, it wasn't ever very huge, but everybody was concerned doing things right. We don't want the problems LA has had. And that was...
Since you've raised this, let's explore that a little bit, because you've seen, as you had mentioned, when you were young growing up here, predominantly Caucasian with some Black and some Latino. But over the decades, the Latino population has grown.
Has surged,
Would you
yes.
talk about that?
Well, it's become a majority. The biggest plurality, I guess you should say. But it hasn't been like horrible, big fights. It just sort of naturally occurred. And I remember I was they labeled people, X, Y, Z. And X were people going to UC. Y was going to state college or community college. And you were separated out. Now, one time I was in a group that they were experimenting with trying to mix them up, the Y's and the X's. And there was like 4 of us in a class of others that was mainly Y's. And I remember them giving us extra work. And he was calling us out, and it didn't seem fair to have extra. And it was board stiff, because I remember this one guy would repeat. He'd tell us to read this for the next class, and we did. And then he'd repeat it all in his own little lecture part of the thing. It was really bored out of my skull. I remember looking out the window at palm trees, winding, and when am I going to get out of this? It did not work. They were trying to challenge us. I know their intentions were good, but God, that was boring. And it wasn't really helping us. It made us not want to stand out. So, I remember there was one Black in the X class I was in. There were usually several. But I remember overhearing my parents talk. They were very concerned we were not getting experience with multiple races. And how were we going to live in the world? And I thought that was strange. I wasn't conscious of all that. But there was like one Black. And he went into the Army and came back. But only one. Now, there are a few Latinos, but there wasn't so much trying to be separate and saving the culture or something. I don't know what they were, but they weren't conscious of them being different. Now, if it came right from Mexico into the classes, there was a problem. They wouldn't have been an X probably, because there were all these tests they were doing all the time. So you just weren't that conscious of badness, you kind of, it was everybody's, people that were paid attention to were not upset about. There wasn't this hate stuff going on as much anyway. I'm sure there were prejudiced people, but just that the leadership wasn't. And you didn't have these nuts that now show up at places on all sides. So it was kind of we were innocent, I think. We didn't know. And Santa Barbara was the same way. There were 6 or 7 Blacks. Santa Barbara was very white.
You chose to go to UC Santa Barbara, presumably because UC Riverside was not existent at that time?
Oh, it was, yeah.
It was just a smaller school.
It was very small, and it was at the home. I wanted to get away. I wanted to be on my own. I wanted to be independent. And it was at the beach. What's not to like? Except for the oil spills that out in the channel. Yeah, everybody had at their front door stuff to take off oil on your feet, because if you walked in the wrong place, you could get oil on your shoes.
And then, of course, the oil spill of 1970 was such a consequential event in terms of state politics.
Yeah, that was after,
leading to the passage of Proposition
which was that?
8.
Yeah, I think it was.
Proposition 8.
Yeah, that was after I left. I graduated in '64, and you realize, Vietnam was starting up, and in graduate school, there were 3 or 4 of us that would go get all the papers. You had to go to downtown, Chicago sometimes to get them, and we would get them, and we would spend the entire day first reading and then discussing. And the one guy in the group was terrified of going to Vietnam. He didn't see any sense in it, and he escaped it. He was legitimately a conscientious objector, but he escaped. Somebody had a low draft number, a high draft number, whatever it is. Yeah, and but it was a good sort of mental training to be able to debate these issues. But the entire Sunday was bent on this stuff.
And of course, the course that we're involved in now uncovers many things that weren't known at the time of the decision making that was happening at that time.
Yeah, it was. We didn't know, and we some of the people in our class thought it was fine to do that, to be over there. But mostly the guys who were going to have to risk their lives were mostly anti. And it was, I wasn't aware. I mean, I was not at risk, as one virtue of being a woman, but I had trouble figuring it out, what was the right thing to do here. My younger brother was in the draft thing, and he didn't get drafted because he got a right kind of number, but he was very conscientiously not going to do it. And I knew one guy, I spent the whole evening with him once, that he was supposed to report for basic training. And so the thing was he going to leave the country, or was he going to report and try to get objection? But so many people were pretending to be conscientious objectors who really weren't. They just didn't want to get killed. Totally understandable. But I kind of was aware of that younger brother. And my brother was dating a girl whose father was a big deal in the Navy, and he got into the reserves, some Navy thing. And I have a feeling that he was with that girl because of the father. I don't really know, but I don't really want to know. But he was on a ship that went up the rivers at least once and had guns shooting at him and stuff. It was pretty scary. But he didn't get killed. That's good.
Referring back just for a moment here, this is a little off topic, but because of the subject we've been dealing with in our course, I wonder if you would speak to your memories of where you were at on November 22nd, 1963.
I was in Santa Barbara, and we did a special edition of the little college paper, and we were totally shocked. It just didn't happen in America. It just seemed so out of the blue. And of course, we were on the gun in time, and so you kind of shift. You couldn't feel. You had to just focus on what we were trying to do, and it was shocking, just total shocking. Your faith in your country, and you shifted gears about how safe you felt, and Johnson we didn't really appreciate. Texas, they seemed like dummies and prejudiced, and that was a no-no. And so that's what I was doing that day and night. Poor printer was sweating, getting it out to the campus in the early morning, and we misspelled in memoriam. We kept trying to find out how we do it. We didn't have cell phones. And we did it wrong. And people were mad at us thinking we were trying to diss him, and we were just felt so horrible. You would learn not to leap. You had to come up with a different word. You can't figure out how to spell it. And there was no dictionary at the printers. It was just awful. Yeah, that's everybody was that way. It was nobody cheering we were aware of anyway. It was just so shocking. That doesn't happen in the U.S.
Would you talk a little bit about your personal life, your marriage, when you married, your life together a little bit, and a little bit about your husband?
We married in 1969, and he was on the paper. He had short hair and shiny black shoes because he'd been in the military, and he had gone to Indiana University, which was a first-rate journalism school, and he was debating between the Forest Service or journalism. But then he volunteered, because then he could be in the language school. He legitimately flunked several times French. And they finally let him get away with not having that. You're supposed to have a language, because he wasn't faking it. He had to read, so his grade average was like C plus or B minus minus because of that. Otherwise he would have been an A student. And he was in basic training when he got his draft notice. So then he went to a language school up in Monterey. Crazy why they let him in there. He was Japanese. It was totally different. And he realized about halfway through that he was never going to be totally fluent, but he was going to pass. So he studied at the beach in Carmel and various places. But then after that, he went to apply. There was a strike on it, L.A. Herald, and one of his best friends was working there, but he wouldn't. That was wrong to break a strike. So he ended up here, where one of his college friends was there, and he put his feet out. That's how in this 80-some-year-old, the owner, Tim's father, almost tripped over him. He was waiting outside somebody's office. Anyway, he did the police thing, and after a while he went to graduate school and became an environmental worker. He was at regional agencies here and in San Diego. And then what happened? And then we went to Sacramento. I got this offer, and he was just starting his new career, so he got on the regional agency up there. And what happened? We didn't divorce. There's markers of so yeah, he left the paper, and in fact for a while he was the religion editor. He was on the copy desk, and they made him do it. And there was this one guy who was kind of a bully, and he would always come at deadline, and Mac told me, we really can't be at deadline. I've got to be putting copy through. And he just wouldn't change. I said, well, you should tell him, I can't deal with you now. You want to come back in 2 hours, I will. Or you do these hours anyway. Which was funny because he was not at all religious. But yeah, I was trying to do a good job. But he went to UCR and got a master's in environmental administration. And so that was good. He got to check that part of the world out. And let's see.
Did you have children together?
No.
Okay. Did he pass away?
Yeah, about 6 years ago. Yeah. It seems like yesterday almost, but he was sick a long time. He had type 2 diabetes, but pretty early. And I got it. I guess I got it shortly after I retired from Press Enterprise. But I've got it under control with meds and diet. But he had all these shots he had to take, insulin. I had to learn that. That was scary to me. They had me practice on oranges. But he was really sick for quite a few years. It was really, he didn't have a fair deal. He was always very supportive of my stuff. Let me blow off steam when I came home. Because, with all the managing people, and I remember my first firing in San Diego, I didn't sleep and all this stuff. I dreamed of people out front yelling at me. It was hard. He was a good man. He did a lot of volunteer work and got a lot of awards and things. From some of the groups, the Clean Air Now, and there's the local groups he was involved in, a lot of stuff. Planted trees. He and Ron Loveridge were out one hot summer day. I was afraid he was going to pass out and expire right then. They both came back red-faced. Because Riverside was refusing to water trees for a while there. And so there's a group that tried to save them. They had this old water truck. They'd go around. In fact, they planted a tree in Mac's name down at Fairmount Park.
How have you spent your time since your retirement?
Well, I thought I was gonna be bored. And I'd always sort of liked trains, model trains, so I got this layout and I was playing with it. Before long, I tried to resign from a couple of the groups I was involved in, and they didn't want me to. I figured they would, but they didn't. Like Monday Morning Group, which I think maybe I should now at this point. But so I stayed involved. I'm still a member of Monday Morning Group. They go to Sacramento and Washington once a year, and we spend a year figuring out problems and what legislative solutions there might be and go and lobby, which is fascinating as my interest in government goes. And I'm not afraid to ask a question, so they like me to kind of push people a bit. What am I else involved in? I'm a Citizens University Committee at UCR. What is the other things? Got these board meetings. I have a book group. I was involved in 3. 2 of them starting out. Well, all of them. I was one of the founders of them. And 3 was way too many. I haven't got time to read papers and do all that. But there's this one group that we, every month, read a book and talk about it. And there was one person, the smartest person, Ann Thomas, who was an environmental lawyer. She would be counter. She'd make us all commit to whether we liked the book or not, and what about it. And then she would come out the opposite way. Very intelligently, make good arguments. I finally figured out what she was doing. But then it was her turn to pick a book. And she picked this book about a beauty queen. And it was horrible. And the bookseller door books, when I asked for the book, I could recommend a book. She knew it was horrible. She was just jerking us. She was a whip smart lawyer, but whoa. The woman knew.
So you've been engaged, and you've been engaged with a number of thoughtful, communicative people that have kept you quite refreshed through the years here.
Yeah, well, they didn't let me get away with anything. They would be upset if the paper done something and they let me have it, which was preparing me for the world, being out in the world. But yeah, they didn't. Everybody at work was always, I was the little boss, and in the community they were afraid of me or whatever, and they didn't respect me. I mean, they didn't let me get away with anything. I mean, they did respect me, but it was good, grounding, because otherwise you think you're something special, and if somebody's giving you what for. There was one time we ran a picture of a cop from a distance down, and he died, and the community did not like that. And you couldn't even tell who it was. We were sweating. We were sweating on getting identity. But it told you the story. It's really tragic. But they dumped on me, and just too many people in the community just thought that was horrible. And you kind of had to know that. When Bilo came back while we were still going through the fight, and my photography staff each came in over the next few days and thanking me for standing up for them. But yeah, I now know it depends on the community that you couldn't take that. It wasn't worth it because people were so upset with us. And the sheriff, who called me trying to get it killed, but he, it was appropriate. But he and the Riverside cops, they went through the parking lot trying to find expired licenses. They stayed outside because they knew when our people were delivering papers at 4 a.m. that people wouldn't pay attention. It zigzag up the street. Safe, totally, but they went after us. And the community was upset, the cops were really upset, and the sheriff had been in trouble with his troops. And after that, and he stood up for them, and after that, I told him, I'm not going to do this again to get you off the hook. And he laughed. We understood. But, he genuinely didn't think it was appropriate. But you couldn't really identify him. It was just his body over there. But you learn things, and you're in a particular community, and you have to understand it.
I'm grateful you mentioned, both the Riverside Police Department and Riverside County Sheriffs. Those are significant players in this territory. As, of course, I'm familiar with the situation in Los Angeles and the relationship with the Los Angeles Times. So I'm sure there have been incidents through the years that when you were on the paper that came into conflict, or at least sharp contrast with them.
Yeah, well, several times. They have their role and we have ours, and we aren't going to back off. And it's just, we're not going to be always supportive if they do something stupid. But we can talk. We talked, but there was a chief that was in trouble. We didn't back down, and people kind of understood. As we found out more of what he was doing, I think over time people kind of see, but they want you to. They want to support the police. In fact, we do too. But you can't not tell people what's going on. So that was our role. But the LA Times is in a horrible situation with them. They do great stories, really interesting things. And they just dig deep, and they find people that will tell them what's what. And it's not a good situation, though, because it'd be better if you could be on the same side, but you can't. It's just different roles.
Marcia, is there anything that I haven't broached with you that is on your mind that you'd like to just talk about regarding the paper? Your life here in Riverside?
It's been a good career, and in retirement, it's still interesting. You know, like I'm a member of the League of Women Voters. I couldn't be members of very many things when I was the city editor, particularly because I was deciding I'd do a story or not. And I just would back away from involvement. But once I became editor and publisher has to be involved. And so I started being involved. Careful, but I was involved. So I really feel like I made the right choice when I came back, and particularly with the original family ownership, because some of the family members would say at a board meeting, "Well, Marcia, when are they going to let you do this?" I thought that was sweet. Though the ex-wife of the editor was always, I don't think she was consciously trying to embarrass him, but it was really weird when they got split and divorced, and they'd be on opposite sides of the board meetings because she had chairs, and it was interesting. They were good people, and Medill was much more profit oriented, but they were interesting because they were a bigger paper, and they were legitimate. In fact, I went there. They're not the owner, but the editor was involved with the American Science newspaper editors, where I was, and then the publisher of the American Association of, what was it, publishers, I guess. We knew them through, and so when they bought it, we weren't alone. In fact, I helped them figure out who to sell to, which was interesting. And the negotiations over the price. And I remember wondering if I should have done it, but I told the Medill people that in the last turn down of price, I said, I don't think you need to double it or anything, but you need to come up a little, and you can probably get it. But and they added that, and they sold. But then they sold to people that owned the Orange County Register. They were strange people. That was a libertarian ownership. And then they sold. It was just very weird. But now the problem is our paper will now say things about Orange County that we would never have run. You know, they have credits and things. It's just, this is sort of on the outskirts. The current ownership, Southern California News Group, it's a venture capital firm out of New York. Totally in profit, and they've stripped tons of people away. It's really sad. I can't defend them most of the time. There's people who are after them. They have several good reporters, really, but still, but only few. They just stripped. The editors are in other places, like one Temecula is kind of the local editor, but it's sad to see what happens. It's really the death. They just, you wonder if it's going to be one inland area press or something. Because San Bernardino things, Orange County things, LA things, because they have papers in all these places. And different, but I had a good time, really. Most of the time. It was tense sometimes. Sorry, don't have anything fun to say.
Well, Marcia, thank you very much. I appreciate your recollection of your career, and I think it'll be a good document going forward for people to know about.